The last sound the village of Izilkiv heard before the silence came was the bell. Not a church bell. Those had already been melted down, stripped from their towers by men with crowbars and government orders. This was a handbell, the kind a schoolteacher carries. It rang 3 times on the morning of November 18, 1932, and then the man ringing it, the local party secretary, a thin man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, stopped walking and looked out over the fields. The fields were empty, not harvested empty, not winter empty. They were wrong empty, the kind of empty that makes the hair on your arms rise before your brain can explain why. He stood there for a long moment. Then he wrote something in the small notebook he always carried, tucked it into his coat, and walked back toward the village center. He never wrote in that notebook again. By spring, he himself would be dead. This is the story of the Holodomor. In Ukrainian, the word breaks down simply: Holod, hunger; mor, plague, or death. Hunger plague, death by starvation. It is the name Ukrainians gave to what happened between 1932 and 1933, when somewhere between 3.5 and 7.5 million people. The estimates still vary. The record still deliberately incomplete. Died not because crops failed, not because drought struck, not because nature turned against them, but because a man in Moscow decided they should die. That man was Joseph Stalin. But before we go to Moscow, before we talk about politics and grain quotas and 5-year plans and the machinery of ideological murder, we need to go to a village, a real one. Because the Holodomor is not, at its core, a political story. It is a human one. And the only way to truly understand what happened is to walk the frozen roads of rural Ukraine in the winter of 1932 and see it for yourself. Ukraine in the early 1930s was the breadbasket of Europe. This is not a metaphor. It was a literal geopolitical fact that had been true for centuries. The black soil of the Ukrainian steppe, called Chornozem, was some of the most fertile agricultural land in the world. Ukrainian wheat fed empires. Ukrainian sunflowers turned their faces to the sky in rows stretching past the horizon. Ukrainian farmers, the Selyani, the peasants, had an intimate, almost sacred relationship with the land they worked. This connection was not merely economic. It was cultural, spiritual, ancestral. The land was not just where you grew food. It was where your grandfather was buried. It was the reason your family had stayed in this particular village for 200 years. It was the source of Ukrainian folk songs, of embroidered patterns on women's blouses, of festivals timed to harvests and plantings. The earth of Ukraine was not property. It was identity. And that is precisely why Stalin wanted to break it. To understand the Holodomor, you must understand what came before it. You must understand collectivization. In 1929, Stalin launched what he called the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. The kulaks, the word means fist, used derisively to describe prosperous peasants, were the supposed enemies of Soviet agricultural policy. In reality, the definition of kulak was so elastic it could stretch to cover virtually any farmer who owned a cow, hired a neighbor's help during harvest, or simply refused to surrender his land to the collective without complaint. Collectivization meant this. The state would seize private farms and merge them into collective enterprises called kolkhozy. The peasants who had worked their own land for generations would become, in effect, laborers on land that now belonged to everyone, which meant, in practice, that it belonged to the state. The peasants of Ukraine did not go quietly. They slaughtered their livestock rather than hand it over. They burned their own barns. They hid grain in cellars, in wells, under floorboards, inside the hollowed-out bodies of dead animals. They resisted with pitchforks, with silence, with the grinding, stubborn non-cooperation of people who have nothing left to lose. Stalin read the reports from Ukraine and reached a conclusion. The resistance wasn't economic. It wasn't desperate. It was nationalist. The Ukrainian peasants weren't fighting to keep their farms. They were fighting to keep Ukraine separate from Russia. They were the foundation of a potential independence movement, a cultural bedrock that had to be shattered if the Soviet project was to succeed. He was going to starve them into submission. Or, if submission wasn't possible, he was simply going to starve them. The apparatus of death was not built overnight. It was constructed carefully, methodically, piece by piece, the way you might build a machine. Each component fitted precisely to the next, each lever and gear designed to produce a specific result. The first component was the grain quota. In the summer of 1932, Soviet officials descended on Ukrainian villages with quotas, numbers representing how much grain each collective farm was required to deliver to the state. These numbers had been set in Moscow by men who had never seen a Ukrainian wheat field, based on projected yields that bore no relationship to reality. The harvest of 1932 had been poor, not catastrophically poor, but poor enough that meeting the quotas would leave nothing for the people who grew the grain. The local officials knew this. Some of them said so. They wrote letters, sent reports, explained that the numbers were impossible. Several were arrested for defeatism and sabotage of the socialist harvest. The rest learned to keep quiet and do their jobs. The grain collection brigades actively went from farm to farm, from house to house. They were composed partly of outsiders sent from Russian cities, partly of local men who had been given power and chose to use it. They carried long metal rods, which they used to probe the earthen floors of peasant homes, searching for hidden caches. They appended furniture. They pulled up floorboards. They reached into the cold ashes of fireplaces and sifted through them with bare hands, looking for kernels of wheat that a family might have hidden. When they found grain, and sometimes when they didn't, they took everything. Not just the grain marked for the quota. Everything. Beets, potatoes, dried beans stored in ceramic pots on the pantry shelf, the string of dried mushrooms hanging from a rafter, the jar of sunflower oil, the braided onions by the door, the small sack of millet that a grandmother had been saving for her grandchild's porridge. One survivor, Mykola Kostirko, who was 11 years old in 1932, recalled decades later. They came in the morning. There were 4 of them. My mother tried to block the door, but one of them pushed her aside like she was made of paper. They went through every drawer, every pot. My mother had hidden a small bag of flour behind a loose brick in the stove wall. They found it in 5 minutes. One of them smiled when he found it. I have never forgotten that smile. The legal framework for this pillaging was provided by a decree issued on August 7, 1932, a document that Ukrainians would come to call, with bitter precision, the Law of 5 Stalks of Grain. Its official title was more bureaucratic: on the preservation of socialist property. It declared that theft of collective farm property was punishable by execution, or, in cases of mitigating circumstances, by 10 years in a labor camp. Theft of collective farm property included, under the law's deliberately broad language, gleaning, the ancient practice of gathering leftover grain from already harvested fields. For thousands of years, in cultures across the world, gleaning had been considered a right of the poor, a safety net woven into the fabric of agricultural society. In the Soviet Ukraine of 1932, a child picking up a few fallen stalks of wheat in a field that had already been stripped could be shot. Children were shot for this. The records of regional Soviet courts from 1932 to 1933 contain the names of children as young as 8 sentenced for theft of socialist property. Not all the sentences were carried out. Some were commuted to labor camp terms. But enough were carried out that the lesson was understood. The wheat belongs to the state. Your hunger is your problem. Your child's hunger is your problem. The state's hunger, the quota, is everyone's problem. The second component of the machine was the Blacklist. On December 6, 1932, the Soviet authorities introduced a system of blacklisting villages that failed to meet their grain quotas. Blacklisted villages were cut off from receiving any goods from state distribution. No food, no consumer products, no salt, no matches, no kerosene for lamps. The village's name would be posted publicly, written on a board in the regional center for all to see, a mark of shame and a death sentence dressed up as administrative procedure. Within weeks, hundreds of Ukrainian villages were on the list. Being on the blacklist meant more than losing access to goods. It also meant intensified searches. Villages on the list received special brigades, not the ordinary activi, but harder men, men who had been specifically told that the population of this village was resisting, was sabotaging, was an enemy of the state. These brigades took seed grain. This was the detail that made survival impossible. Peasant farmers, even in the worst years, even when they had hidden the last food in the house, had kept aside seed grain for the next planting. The logic was biological, instinctive. You eat the flesh, but preserve the bones. You survive the winter because spring will come, and you need something to put in the ground. When the brigades took the seed grain, there was no spring. There was only a longer winter. One account, preserved in a Ukrainian diaspora archive and later verified by historians, describes a brigade leader explaining this with unusual frankness to a group of village elders. You will not need it. You will not be here in the spring. The ones who cooperate with the state may survive. The ones who hide grain will not. He was telling the truth. By January 1933, the dying had begun in earnest. It is difficult, it may be impossible, to fully render in words what starvation does to a human body. We can describe the stages, the initial hunger, which is sharp and demanding and feels like an emergency. The period when the body begins to consume its own fat reserves, and the hunger becomes something duller and more constant, a gray presence rather than a sharp one. The stage when the fat is gone and the muscles begin to go, and the body starts to eat itself in the most literal sense. And finally, the end stages, which are marked by what doctors call edema, the grotesque swelling caused by protein deficiency, which gives starving people the paradoxical appearance of bloating while they waste. In Ukrainian, survivors called this swelling puklina, the swollen ones. A 7-year-old child in a village outside Kharkiv in January 1933 would not have understood these clinical terms. She would have understood that her stomach hurt, that her little brother cried at night and then stopped crying, that her mother no longer got up from the bed except to check whether there was anything at all, left in the house to eat. There wasn't. The village of Hanivia in the Kharkiv region had a pre-famine population of approximately 1,200 people. By the end of 1933, fewer than 400 remained. The rest were dead or had fled, and fleeing was not easily accomplished because the third component of the machine had been installed in January 1933, internal passports. On January 22, 1933, Stalin and Molotov signed a directive specifically prohibiting Ukrainian peasants from leaving their villages to search for food. The internal passport system, introduced nominally as a general administrative measure, was deployed in Ukraine and the North Caucasus, another region with a significant Ukrainian population, as a cordon. Checkpoints were established on roads. Railway stations were watched. Any peasant found traveling without authorization was turned back to die. The logic was explicit in internal Soviet communications, later recovered from the archives. The movement of the starving peasants into Russian cities was disrupting urban life and spreading panic. The solution was not to feed them. The solution was to lock them in place. This directive had an additional effect that the authorities may or may not have fully anticipated. It trapped not only the dying, but everyone who might have warned the outside world. Foreign journalists in Moscow were largely kept away from Ukraine. The few who tried to travel there found their visas declined or their movements tightly controlled. The Ukrainian villages were sealed as completely as any prison, and inside the sealed villages, the dying continued. What does a village look like when it is starving? Survivors who spoke to historians in later decades, or who gave testimony to the Ukrainian diaspora organizations that began collecting accounts as early as the 1940s, describe a landscape of almost surreal desolation. The dogs disappeared first, then the cats. Then, when there were no more animals, people began to eat things that are not food. Tree bark stripped from the birches and boiled into a gray liquid. Leather belts cut into strips and softened in water. Clay mixed with the last flour dust scraped from empty sacks. Boots were boiled. Grass was eaten raw in spring, when it appeared, by people who had survived to see it. The houses fell silent in a particular way. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of absence. Neighbors stopped visiting, not because of unfriendliness, but because there was nothing to offer. No tea, no bread, no conversation that wasn't about the same unbearable subject. And because visiting meant being seen, and being seen meant being known as alive, and being known as alive created obligations that no one had the strength to fulfill. The bodies appeared gradually, then suddenly. At first, a death was still a death. Someone died, neighbors came, there was a burial. But as the weeks went on and the bodies accumulated, the rituals fell away. There was no strength to dig graves in frozen ground. There was no wood for coffins. The wood had been burned for warmth. Bodies were left in houses, left by roads, stacked in barns. In some villages, the authorities organized carts, crude wooden sleds pulled by the surviving horses, that went through the streets each morning to collect the dead. The men driving the carts developed, by necessity, a particular numbness. One of them, Petro Vaskevich, gave testimony 50 years later. He was 17 in 1933. He said, "We learned not to look at the faces. If you looked at the faces, you recognized people. If you recognized people, you could not continue working. So we looked at the ground, and we loaded, and we looked at the ground." Where were the bodies taken? In some places, mass graves were dug at the edge of villages, shallow, because the ground was hard and the diggers were weak. In other places, the bodies were simply left in the fields or in the ravines at the edges of settlements, covered with whatever snow fell. In spring, the smell told you where the dead were. The stories that are hardest to tell, the ones that historians approach with the most care and the most pain, are the stories of mothers. What starvation does to the maternal instinct is something that has no comfortable framework. The bond between a mother and child is perhaps the most fundamental in human biology, wired deep into the brainstem, pre-linguistic, pre-cultural, and the Holodomor bent it, twisted it, in some cases, broke it entirely. Let us begin with what most mothers did. Most mothers starved themselves first. This is documented across hundreds of testimonies, consistent across regions, consistent across months. Mothers told their children the food was gone when they had hidden a small amount for the child alone. They sat at the table with their children and pretended to eat when there was nothing to eat, miming the motions of spooning invisible porridge to their mouths, saying, "I ate already, my love. This is for you." When there was one egg and 3 children, the egg was divided in ways that left the mother with nothing. When there was a last piece of bread and a mother and a child, the child ate the bread. And then the bread was gone, and the question became different. Halina Krasi, from the village of Stara Huta in Vinnytsia region, was 4 years old in 1933. She survived because her mother carried her, on foot, 80 kilometers to the city of Vinnytsia, walking at night to avoid the checkpoints. Her mother died 2 weeks after arriving in the city. Halina was taken in by strangers. She said, in her testimony given in 1990, "I never saw my mother cry. Not once. She was already past crying, I think. By the time we walked, she just walked and held me, walked and held me. She was very thin. I remember her ribs through her coat when I held on to her." This is one kind of story. There are others. There are accounts, verified, corroborated, appearing in multiple independent testimonies of mothers who went mad from hunger. Hunger psychosis is a documented medical phenomenon. Severe and prolonged caloric restriction affects the brain, causes personality changes, induces states that can only be described as psychiatric. In the villages of Ukraine in the winter of 1933, there were women who had been rational, loving, ordinary mothers in October, and who by February were no longer themselves. One account from the village of Pisky in Poltava region describes a woman found by neighbors crouching in a corner of her house, incoherent, unable to speak, with the remains of a meal on the floor. The meal was her youngest child. She had 2 other children who were still alive, both severely starving. She did not recognize the neighbors who came in. She did not recognize her living children. She died 3 days later without regaining full coherence. This account is not unique. There are dozens like it in the archives. The Soviet authorities, aware of these cases, used them for 2 purposes. Internally, they were used to justify tighter control, evidence that the Ukrainian peasantry was savage, uncivilized, requiring the firm hand of socialist management. Externally, on the rare occasions when reports leaked out, they were denied entirely, or attributed to the inherent backwardness of the rural population. The word for the act of eating one's own family, the clinical term is autophagy in its extended sense, though historians use the term cannibalismo from the Soviet records themselves, appears in NKVD reports with disturbing regularity. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, kept careful records of these cases, not because they were troubled by them, because they needed data. The data from Ukraine in 1932 to 1933 shows thousands of recorded cases. The actual number was certainly higher. There is a category of account that is perhaps the most difficult to process morally, and which must be approached with the understanding that it represents not evil, but the absolute extremity of human desperation. Some mothers, in the final stages of starvation, with nothing left to give their children, made a choice. Tiziana Barna, in testimony gathered by researcher James Mace in the 1980s, described what her mother told her many years later. In the winter of 1933, Tiziana's mother had been alone with 3 children. Tiziana was the eldest at 9. Her brothers were 6 and 3. The 3-year-old was already beyond help. He had been beyond help for some time, but her mother could not acknowledge it. She lay with him every night, keeping him warm with her own body heat, which was itself failing. One morning, she woke and he was cold. She told me, Tiziana said, that she felt relief. She told me this when I was grown and she was old, and she cried when she said it. She felt relief because he had been suffering, and she had been keeping him alive with only her body heat and her prayers. And now it was over, and she was ashamed of the relief for the rest of her life. She said, I am a monster. I said, no, Mama, you were in hell. And she said, they are the same place. When both parents died, the children were left alone. This was not a rare occurrence. In some villages, in the worst months, it was the common occurrence. Parents died before children because parents had been giving their food to their children. Parents died before children because they had already been weakened by the longer grind of previous hunger seasons. Parents died before children, and then the children were alone in houses with dead parents, and the question of what happened next has no simple answer. Some children were taken in by relatives, grandparents, aunts, uncles, if those relatives still lived and still had any capacity to feed another mouth. The calculus of this was brutal. A family already at the edge of starvation, taking in an orphan nephew, might be choosing to share the death rather than prevent it. Many made that choice anyway. The instinct to care for a child, to reach out a hand to a small person in need, did not vanish entirely, even in conditions designed to extinguish it. Other children, and there were thousands of them, walked. They walked toward cities because they had heard or hoped that cities had food. They walked along roads that were patrolled by police charged with turning back migrants. Some were caught and returned to their villages. Some were not caught because they were too small to be considered serious threats. A 6-year-old wandering along a road presented a different kind of problem for a checkpoint guard than an adult man. The cities, when the children reached them, were not the promised land. In Kharkiv, which was at this time the capital of Soviet Ukraine, in a major industrial center, the population of street children, besprizorniki, the neglected ones, swelled to numbers that overwhelmed all institutional response. Photographs from Kharkiv in 1933, some taken by Austrian engineer Alexander Wienerberger at great personal risk, showed children lying in doorways, sitting against building walls, lying in the street itself, in states of such extreme emaciation that they look like photographs from a different category of horror entirely. Wienerberger was one of the few people who documented what he saw with a camera. He later published his photographs in a book in Vienna. The Soviet Union called them fabrications. They were not fabrications. They were Tuesday in Kharkov in 1933. The city authorities' response to the dying children was a mixture of helplessness and bureaucracy. Some children were taken to orphanages and hospitals, where the medical staff, themselves operating under severe resource constraints, tried to stabilize them with whatever food was available. The mortality rates in these institutions were high. Children who had been starving for months could not always be saved, even when food was finally provided. Refeeding a severely malnourished child requires specific medical knowledge and careful management. In 1933 Ukraine, neither the knowledge nor the resources were consistently available. Other children were simply picked up by the militia, the police, and relocated, sometimes to other towns, sometimes back toward the countryside they had come from. The relocation solved the problem of visible dying children in the city centers. It did not solve the problem of dying children. The schools that were still functioning, many had closed because teachers were dead or had fled, or could not motivate children who were too weak with hunger to learn, became sites of both tragedy and occasional grace. Teachers who stayed described classrooms that emptied week by week. A child who had been present on Friday was not present on Monday, and no one said why, because everyone knew why. Teachers, themselves hungry, who had used their own meager rations to bring small amounts of food to school for the worst-off students, were occasionally caught doing so and reprimanded. Such private charity was, in the Soviet framework, a sign of sentimentality and a circumvention of proper socialist food distribution. One teacher, Hanna Sasanska, kept a diary. It was hidden after the worst period and later recovered by her granddaughter. A passage from March 1933 reads, in translation, "Today only 11 children came. Last month there were 31. I have stopped writing their names when they stop coming because it becomes too much to write. I have started writing the weather instead. Today, overcast, cold, the same. She survived. Most of her students did not. Who were the men who did this?" This is a question historians have wrestled with, because the answer is complicated in the way that the answers to such questions always are. The men who went from house to house taking food were not, by and large, monsters in the way we usually imagine monsters. They were men. Specific, individual men with mothers and fathers and the whole range of human complexity inside them. Some were true believers. The Soviet ideological project had, by 1932, produced an entire generation of young men for whom the vocabulary of class struggle, capitalist sabotage, and socialist construction was not rhetoric but reality. They genuinely believed that the Ukrainian peasants who hid grain were enemies of the people. They genuinely believed that the resistance to collectivization was a form of counter-revolutionary warfare. In their framework, what they were doing was not cruelty. It was necessity. Some were opportunists. The positions of authority created by the collectivization process came with material benefits, access to food, to housing, to a status that was unavailable to them in ordinary circumstances. Men who had been at the bottom of the village hierarchy found themselves suddenly at the top. The power this granted was intoxicating, and in some, it produced a cruelty that seemed to have been waiting for exactly this permission to emerge. Some were cowards. They had been given orders. The orders came from above, from a system that punished non-compliance severely. A brigade member who refused to take a family's last food, who turned away from the child standing in the corner watching, might find himself accused of soft-pedaling or collaborating with Kulak elements. The Gulag was not an abstraction. It was a very real destination. And so they took the food, and they looked away from the child, and they told themselves that they were only following orders. This last category, the followers of orders, is the largest. It is also, in many ways, the most instructive, because the Holodomor was not primarily the work of sadists. It was primarily the work of ordinary people who had been placed inside a system that made murder the path of least resistance, and who chose the path of least resistance because choosing otherwise required a courage most people do not have. There were exceptions. There were village officials who falsified records, reporting higher grain deliveries than had actually been collected to protect their populations. Some were caught and arrested. Some were shot. Some managed to walk the line long enough to make a difference. A few extra weeks, a few hundred kilograms of grain that stayed in the village instead of going to the state quota, translated into lives. There were urban workers sent to villages as part of the Collectivization Brigades, who pocketed their brigade member identification cards and slipped food to the people they were supposed to be robbing. There were NKVD men who looked away at checkpoints when they saw a woman with a child trying to reach the city. There were doctors in city hospitals who claimed patients weighed more than they did to qualify them for better food rations. These small acts of resistance and decency are documented, though they are harder to find in the archives than the acts of brutality, because they were deliberately concealed by the people who committed them. They are not less real for being smaller. They are perhaps, in their way, more heroic, because they occurred inside the same pressures that turned other men into instruments of death, and they chose differently. The question of what the Soviet leadership knew, and when, is no longer seriously debated by historians. They knew everything. Stalin received regular reports from the NKVD on the situation in Ukraine. The death tolls were tracked, if not accurately counted. The letters from desperate local officials, pleading for food relief, were read and filed, and in some cases annotated Stalin's own hand. His annotations were not expressions of concern. They were expressions of suspicion. The request is exaggerated. The local officials are saboteurs. Do not reduce the quota. Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's close associate and the man most directly responsible for implementing policy in Ukraine, visited the affected regions in 1932. He returned to Moscow and reported not on the starvation he had certainly observed, but on the inadequate grain collection and the sabotage of socialist agriculture by the Ukrainian peasantry. Molotov, who co-signed the decree sealing Ukrainian borders, later claimed he hadn't fully understood the scale of what was happening. The archives suggest otherwise. The archives suggest that he understood very clearly and chose, with full knowledge, to continue. On February 1, 1933, Stalin received a letter from Mykola Skripnik, a senior Ukrainian communist official, begging him to allow food imports into the starving regions. Stalin did not reply. The grain collection continued. The quotas were not reduced. The choice was made deliberately, with full information, by men who knew exactly what they were choosing. The Holodomor was not a secret, exactly. It was something more insidious than a secret. It was a lie that many people found convenient to believe. The Soviet Union in 1933 was in a particular and delicate position in the eyes of the Western world. The Great Depression had shattered faith in capitalist economies. Unemployment in the United States had reached 25%. In Germany, the economic collapse had contributed directly to the rise of Adolf Hitler, who had become chancellor in January 1933, the same month Stalin sealed Ukraine's borders. The Western intellectual left and a significant portion of the Western political center had genuine hopes invested in the Soviet experiment. Into this climate of hope and wishful thinking came reports of a famine in Ukraine. Some of these reports were accurate. The Welsh journalist Gareth Jones traveled to Ukraine in March 1933 without authorization, on foot, through the countryside, and witnessed the dying villages firsthand. He returned and published a series of dispatches describing what he had seen with journalistic precision and moral horror. He named what he saw. He said people were starving to death in massive numbers because the Soviet state was taking their food. He was attacked immediately. The man who led the attack was Walter Duranty, Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times and the holder of a Pulitzer Prize awarded, in part, for his reporting on the Soviet Union. Duranty had spent years cultivating his access to Soviet officials, and he was not willing to sacrifice that access for the sake of a story that his sources denied. He wrote a piece describing Jones's reports as exaggerated, claiming that while there was hardship and shortage in some areas, there was no famine. He offered a phrase that became notorious: "You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs." The eggs in this metaphor were millions of human beings. Duranty's denial was widely believed, or at least widely used as cover for not believing the alternative. Some journalists simply didn't know the truth. Others suspected it, but couldn't get access. Others, like Duranty, knew more than they reported and chose strategic ignorance. The British Foreign Office received multiple reports of the famine from its consular officials in Ukraine. The reports were classified, and the government chose not to make them public, in part because the United Kingdom was in the process of normalizing trade relations with the Soviet Union and did not want a scandal. The United States recognized the Soviet Union diplomatically for the first time in November 1933, as the Holodomor was ending and the bodies were being counted. The timing was not coincidental. The political desire for normalization with the USSR created a powerful incentive to look away from inconvenient evidence. Gareth Jones, vindicated by history, died under mysterious circumstances in 1935 in Inner Mongolia. He was 33 years old. The denial was not only external. Inside the Soviet Union, inside Ukraine itself, a parallel reality was maintained with astonishing discipline and violence. The very word famine, Holod, was prohibited in official discourse. Regional newspapers continued to publish reports of successful grain collection, of enthusiastic kolkhoz workers exceeding their quotas, of socialist agriculture triumphing over capitalist backwardness. Journalists who worked for Soviet publications knew better than to write what they saw. Their editors knew better than to print it. Their editors' supervisors in Moscow knew better than to allow it to be printed. The entire apparatus of Soviet information management, from the highest editorial levels to the village party secretary writing his local bulletin, was aligned around a single task: making the death invisible. And if you were a Ukrainian villager who had somehow survived, and you met someone from the city, or wrote a letter to a relative, you chose your words carefully. Not because you doubted your own experience, because you had learned with absolute certainty that saying the wrong thing could be the last thing you said. The archives contain letters that survivors kept, that were later donated to historical collections, in which people write around the starvation with the elaborate indirection of people who know they are being watched. Times are difficult here. The food situation is complicated. We are managing. The letters of the dying, describing their deaths in language so guarded that only another Ukrainian of that generation would recognize the spring came to Ukraine in 1933. For those who lived to see it, the spring was salvation and horror simultaneously. Salvation because the earth, finally thawed, began to produce things that could be eaten. The first green shoots, the early grass, the wild garlic that pushed up in the wet places near streams. People who had been dying by increments found themselves suddenly able to eat, able to put something in their bodies that wasn't bark or leather. And the body's resilience, the body's astonishing desire to live responded. But spring also revealed what winter had done. The snow melted, and the bodies appeared. They had been there all along, but the snow had covered them, and now they were visible, in the fields, in the ravines, in the empty houses with their doors standing open. The smell of the villages in the spring of 1933 was something that survivors never forgot and could not describe without their faces changing. There were villages in which no one was left. Not almost no one, no one. The activists who came to make the spring planting assessment found houses empty of everything except the traces of lives. A chair, a broken tool, a child's toy, the dark marks on the floor where a bed had stood. The village was intact in its physical form and entirely absent in its human one. These were not destroyed villages. No buildings had been burned, no wells had been poisoned, no physical assault had been carried out. The structures still stood. The streets were still there. The church, if the church hadn't yet been demolished, as many were, still faced the village square. But the people were gone. The state's response to these empty villages was, in its way, as revealing as anything that had come before. Officials noted the depopulation in their reports, flagged it as a labor shortage problem, and recommended the resettlement of Russian families from other regions of the Soviet Union into the empty Ukrainian villages. This was done. In the years following the Holodomor, Russian and other non-Ukrainian populations were deliberately settled into areas depopulated by the famine. The demographic character of eastern and southern Ukraine was permanently altered. This was not an accident. It was policy. For those who survived, who walked out of the winter of 1932-33 with their lives, though rarely with anything else, the task of rebuilding was something for which there is no adequate word. You had watched your children die. You had watched your parents die. You had eaten things no human being should eat and done things no human being should have to do. And now you were expected to go back to work on the collective farm, to plant the spring crop, to continue being the productive agricultural unit that the Soviet state required. And many did. Because what else was there? The grief was not publicly expressed, could not be publicly expressed. To mourn too openly, to say too clearly what had happened and who was responsible, was dangerous. The official position was that nothing unusual had occurred, that there had been some difficulties, some shortages in certain areas, but that the socialist collective farm system had triumphed and the harvest would be good. The survivors learned to carry their grief privately inside. They carried it for decades. The famine was not something that could be discussed freely until well after the fall of the Soviet Union. Entire families, entire communities, kept the secret not because they wanted to, but because the keeping of the secret was the condition of continued survival. This silence had its own costs. Trauma that cannot be named, cannot be processed. The children and grandchildren of Holodomor survivors grew up in households where something enormous had happened and could not be spoken about, where the adults sometimes stared at nothing, sometimes hoarded food obsessively, sometimes flinched at the sight of official uniforms, and could not explain why. The trauma passed down through generations in the way that unspeakable things do, not in words, but in the body, in the reflex, in the way a grandmother pressed extra bread into your hands and watched you eat it with an intensity that had nothing to do with hospitality. How many people died? The honest answer is that we don't know with precision, and that the imprecision is itself evidence of crime. The Soviet census of 1937, which would have made the demographic impact of the Holodomor visible in the numbers, was suppressed. Stalin, reviewing its results, found the population figures too low and concluded that the census takers must have been saboteurs and wreckers. The demographers who had conducted the census were arrested. Several were executed. A new census was commissioned, and the new census produced the correct numbers. The census takers of 1937, the ones who were arrested for accurately counting the dead, were rehabilitated posthumously in 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death. The original census data was partially recovered from Soviet archives in the 1990s. It confirmed what the demographers had found. The population of Ukraine was dramatically smaller than expected, with the deficit concentrated in the rural regions in the years 1932 to 1934. Modern historical research, synthesizing the recovered census data, regional mortality records, survivor testimony, and epidemiological modeling, estimates the death toll at between 3.5 million and 7.5 million people. The middle estimate, most commonly cited, is approximately 3.9 million excess deaths directly attributable to starvation and starvation-related illness in 1932 to 1933. To put that number in context, the Holodomor killed more Ukrainians in 18 months than the United Kingdom lost in all of World War II. It killed more people than perished in the Holocaust's killing centers in 1942, not the full duration of the Holocaust, but its single most murderous year. These are not numbers. They are people. They had names. Mykola, who was 11, who watched the men with the metal rods search his house. Halina, who was 4, whose mother carried her 80 kilometers on foot and then died. Petro, who was 17, who learned not to look at the faces on the collection cart. Tishiana, whose mother said, "I am a monster," and whose daughter said, "No, Mama, you were in hell." Hannah, the teacher, who stopped writing names and started writing weather. The Holodomor Memorial in Kyiv contains in its underground hall a wall of lights, one light for each village affected by the famine. There are more than 4,000 lights. Visitors walk through the hall in silence. There is nothing to say that is equal to 4,000 lights. The Holodomor is recognized as genocide by Ukraine, the United States, Canada, Australia, and dozens of other countries. It is not recognized as genocide by Russia, which maintains that the famine was a generalized Soviet tragedy affecting multiple nationalities, not a targeted campaign against Ukrainians specifically. The debate is, at its core, a legal and definitional one. The 1948 UN Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The question for the Holodomor is whether the Soviet state intended to destroy Ukrainians as a national group, or whether it intended to collectivize agriculture, and the deaths were, in some sense, an unintended, if wholly foreseeable, consequence. The evidence for genocidal intent is substantial. The policies most lethal to Ukraine, the specific quotas, the blacklisting system, the border closures, the prohibition on leaving, were applied differently in Ukraine and in other Soviet regions. The Russian Volga region, which experienced food shortages in the same period, was not sealed. Its peasants were not prevented from moving to cities. Its villages were not blacklisted with the same severity. The death rates in the Russian famine regions, while significant, were a fraction of those in Ukraine. Ukraine was treated differently because Ukraine was Ukraine, because the Ukrainians were not just inconvenient. They were, from Stalin's perspective, a political threat. The liquidation of the Ukrainian peasantry was simultaneously the liquidation of Ukrainian national identity, the destruction of the class that most strongly preserved Ukrainian language, Ukrainian folk culture, Ukrainian resistance to Russification. Timothy Snyder, one of the most eminent historians of the period, has written that the Holodomor combined a class war against peasants with a national war against Ukrainians in a way that made it both a social and a national catastrophe. The intent may not have been extermination as an end in itself, but extermination as a means to an end, the subjugation of a nation, and whether that constitutes genocide, under the legal definition, is a question that serious scholars continue to debate. What is not debated among serious scholars is the deliberateness. This was not a natural disaster. It was not mismanagement. It was not an unfortunate consequence of an otherwise well-intentioned policy. It was a decision, made by specific people, implemented by specific apparatus, maintained against specific evidence of its lethal consequences, to starve a population into submission. The crops grew, the soil was fertile, the food existed. It was taken deliberately by the state from people who grew it, and those people were then prevented from going anywhere else to find food. That is not policy. That is murder. Ukraine today observes the Holodomor every year on the 4th Saturday of November. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a minute of silence is observed nationally. Candles are lit. Bells are rung in churches, the same churches whose bells were melted down by the men with the crowbars in 1929 and 1930, rebuilt, rehung, still ringing. The people who survived the Holodomor and lived long enough to see Ukraine independent, to see the archives opened, to see their government formally name what had been done to them. Many of them said the same thing. Not that the naming healed the wound, not that recognition erased what had happened, but that it mattered to be believed, that it mattered, after 60 years of enforced silence, to be told, "We hear you. We know it happened." Halina Budko was born in 1928 and survived the Holodomor as a child in the Poltava region. She gave her testimony in 1993, 2 years after Ukrainian independence. She was 65 years old. She said, at the end of her account, something that has stayed with everyone who has read it. "I used to dream about bread. For many years after, I would dream about bread. A loaf of bread, just a loaf of bread on a table, and I would reach for it in the dream and wake up. And for a moment, before I remembered where I was and what year it was, I was still hungry. It took a long time before the bread in the dream was just bread. The wheat still grows in Ukraine. The black soil, the Chornozem, is still there, still among the most fertile earth in the world. The sunflowers still turn their faces. The embroidered blouses are still made by women who learned the patterns from their grandmothers and their grandmothers' grandmothers. The people are still there. That is the last thing to say about the Holodomor, not as consolation, not as a redemptive arc imposed on a story that cannot be redeemed, but as fact. They tried to destroy a people. The people did not destroy. The names on the memorial wall in Kyiv are Ukrainian names. The woman in the wheat field is Ukrainian. The children who go to school today in the villages of Poltava and Vinnytsia, and Kharkiv, the villages where the collection brigades came with their metal rods, are Ukrainian. History does not always vindicate the living, but sometimes the simple act of continuing to exist is the most profound statement a people can make. The bell rang 3 times in Vasilkiv on the morning of November 18, 1932. The fields were empty. The silence that followed was meant to be permanent.